There's no surprise today that when we talk about China, and that's right, China, one of the largest economies in the world. Recently, the news headline came out and it says that China has become more popular than US in much of the world, and based on the survey, China's global image is on the rise as America's source. According to a Pew Research survey, more than 40,000 people around the globe. In the article that specifically pointed out people in 27 out of the 36 countries and territories have a higher opinion of China than the US among the 20 nations also polled in the version of the survey Pew conducted last year. Believe it or not, that in a broader sense, the data even suggests that the global perception could be shifting to give less weight to the freedom and democracy. When we talk about China today, it's no longer just about the political interest. And more, people are also asking the question, and what about what we called China's influence from this economic perspective and also from the cultural perspective? In this episode, we're going to dive into a little bit more regarding what is China doing and how China is winning friends and influencing people domestically and internationally. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, Mr. Eric Olander. Eric is the editor-in-chief of the China Global South Project. Well, Eric, and welcome to the show.
Will, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely, Eric. Such an honor to have you on our program. Now, as I mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because this amazing article that you wrote recently, it's called How China is Winning Friends and Influencing People. Private companies are making Beijing look good in the developing world. As I mentioned in the intro, that today when we talk about China, specifically according to the survey, that more countries, especially among the developing countries, seeing China more favorable than the US or than any other countries. Let's start with a fundamental or basic question, Eric. Surprised, unsurprised, or perhaps there's something that we need to understand about China, not only about this political drive, but also about this economic ambition, or should we say, connections around the world. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so these surveys from Pew, this is not new. In fact, last year's Pew survey said something very similar. There are regional surveys by Arab Barometer, Afro Barometer in Africa, and others that point to the same thing. I think we need to be a little bit careful, though, with these numbers. One of the things that the numbers reveal is deep displeasure with the United States and the global West, if you will, Europe, Japan, and the system, if you will. What we find in our own research and our work over the past 20 years at the China Global South Project is that people have pretty low familiarity with China. That is, they really don't like the US. But when these pollsters go back and ask follow-up questions to a lot of the respondents who say, well, I like China more than the US, they'll say, well, why? Well, they're not the US. And, well, do you have a deeper reason why? No, they're just not the US. And so a lot of times these more favorable numbers for China tend to be an opposition vote, if you will, with the Western system, not necessarily a full-throated endorsement of China. People generally have high familiarity with the West because of all of the discourse power that the West has, and pretty low familiarity with China. People will use, and this is what we talked about in our Foreign Affairs article, people are very familiar with Chinese products, Chinese services. They now more and more will see Chinese cars and Chinese technology, and then on social media they'll see, these videos of, the China maxing videos of Chongqing and Shanghai, and think, wow. But they don't have a very deep understanding of China, the history, the people, the culture, all of the different things, where they do have much deeper understandings of Western culture and Western power.
Eric, I want to dive into your article and let's elaborate the conversation a bit more. This is what you wrote, and I quote, "The United States is ill-equipped to counter the influence that China gets from indispensable presence in the developing world. American firms have few answers to the product and content that global consumers increasingly want and find from China, end quote. Eric, let's talk
Yeah.
about this. If I remember clearly, that not too long ago, even today, we're still talking about the state visit from the sitting US President Donald Trump to Beijing. And of course, that signified a major milestone for political reason and also for economic purposes. But today, when we look at the domestic political confusion, bewilderment in the US, that, correct me if I'm wrong, that naturally offered opportunity for China to continue to seek or broaden opportunities. So based on what you wrote, the US is ill-equipped to counter the influence of China. How much can we understand is that because domestic chaos or domestic uncertainty for the US, that basically bring a lot of advantages to China? I see you're shaking hands, so debate
Yeah,
against me.
I think we're conflating a couple different things here. We're conflating domestic politics and domestic political systems with the rise, for example, of Chinese goods, services, products, and whatnot in the corporate engagement. So one of the key points we wanted to make in the article was that in much of the developing world, particularly for those of us like me who lived here in Southeast Asia for the past 15 years, China and Chinese products are increasingly becoming the operating system of daily life. That is, when you go to a store and you want to buy a tea kettle, it comes from China. When you are, the online e-commerce services that we use here, Alibaba owns Lazada, for example. It's Cainiao, which is Alibaba's logistics arm that sends an email when a product comes the next day. Increasingly, we're seeing Chinese brands like Chuggy and Luckin Coffee coming up. We're seeing BYD and more than 10 Chinese auto brands here. The clothes we buy, the food we eat, a lot of it is either comes from China or is partially made in China, or the inputs come from China and it's made. So China now touches so much of daily life for people in the developing world. We don't see that as much in the US and Europe because there are these walls. You don't see BYD. I mean, of course, if you go to Target and you go to Walmart, significant portions of the products or parts of the products are made in China. But the operating system of daily life, that is the phone, the apps, the e-commerce services, the vehicles that get us around, or the battery technology here in Vietnam. We've got a VinFast, but a lot of VinFast, which is the local EV company, is using Chinese technology. So it's either made by China, made in China, or some combination thereof. Now, in terms of what you were talking about, the chaos of American politics, that's not really relevant in this discussion here in one sense. This has more to do with the fact that U.S. companies, for the most part, are high-margin companies. Apple does not want to make a product for the developing world and the world's poorest consumers because there's just no margin in it. GM, Ford, even OpenAI. OpenAI is a very expensive product that's really meant for the world's wealthiest companies and the wealthiest consumers, whereas DeepSeek is an open source product. Whereas BYD is making $10,000, $15,000 cars that are well suited for people with much more limited income. So China and Chinese companies have really targeted the bottom of the pyramid in terms of profitability. And here's the thing. You can make a lot of money selling phones to African consumers. And this was the best example made by Transsion, a company that I featured in the article and the one that people outside of Africa don't really know much about. But Transsion is now a $7 billion technology giant that sells predominantly to Africans because they tailored the product specifically for African consumers. That is, they adjusted the AI and the algorithms in the cameras that they would be more adaptable for people with darker skin complexions. They have longer battery lives, multiple SIM cards. They're dust resistant. The music services that they use is Boomplay, which is a Chinese music service, streaming service, and it's the number one streaming service in Africa. And they locked up the rights to French language music and African music long before Apple and Spotify came into the market. So again, we have all of these examples of where Chinese companies have been much more adaptable to this consumer with more limited disposable income and discretionary income. And American companies just have not optimized for that because the profit margins aren't as big.
Eric, that exactly echo what you wrote in the article, which says that most American products are out of the reach of ordinary consumers, that China is becoming the country that provide the goods and services that are part of people's daily lives. But let's deepen our conversation a little bit more. You went on to write that company trying to survive the effects of China's growth model at home are giving the country the kind of positive association abroad that Beijing has been unable to generate from its own top-down effort. Let's talk about a little bit more. Again, there's no surprise, there's no denying that Vietnam, the Philippines, and Cambodia, we're talking about most of the countries in Southeast Asia, are beautiful in many ways. And I remember distinctively that last time I was in Vietnam a couple years ago, when I talked to the consumers, when I talked to just the younger generations, they are still excited about the domestic brands. But meanwhile, they were kind of welcoming, but still dancing in this idea whether what China is going to do or the Chinese commodities. So by looking at or listening to what you just explained, how about the domestic made products? How does that fit into the whole picture? Because again, I think is there really concern that there seem to be a local competition, where there to be a competition between China made product versus domestic made product? What do you say to that?
So the China problem, if you will, is that China is both the best thing that's ever happened to many developing countries and at the same time the worst thing that's ever happened. The best thing, and let's talk about this, and this is what the article focused on quite a bit, is the fact that China and Chinese products, the ability to make a smartphone for less than $70 is radical. That brought the next billion people online. That alone, just that innovation, that China was able to bring the price point of a smartphone to below $100 and in many cases below $70, allowed another billion people to get online. And the reason why this is so important is because all of these privileges of being online, and again, the ability to take pictures and post them and to follow, TikTok and to follow and to be part of this, was excluded for people who just didn't have the means. And, there were people who had access and people who didn't have access. And so the fact that Chinese technology, and people know that these are Chinese phones, it's not a secret. When you see a Huawei, a ZTE, a Xiaomi, an Oppo phone, and we see them everywhere here, they know where they come from. I mean, they're not pretending they don't come from China. And people know that this allowed them to be part of this global community online. It's much more inclusive. Same now for cars and mobility, that the ability to move from bicycle to motorbike to a small car is a progression of development and and the sense of modernity, that China is making modernity possible for people who otherwise were shut out of modernity. And they're being able to do it at a price point that others just haven't been able to do it. That is the positive side. Let's talk about the negative side. You talk about the domestic competitors.
That's right.
What is Kenya going to sell China? What is Vietnam going to sell China? What is Brazil going to sell China? What is Germany going to sell China? China has been able to create a manufacturing system that is unrivaled in human history. It produces at a scale, quantity, and speed and cost that nobody can rival. This is the China price. We talk about this on our show quite a bit, the famed $6 toaster, if you will. They are able to produce a high quality toaster for $6 or a high quality smartphone for under $70. No one can do that because the infrastructure, the supply chains, the technical know-how, all of that just isn't in place at the scale that it is in China. And if you've ever been to one of these Chinese port areas like Dongguan in southern China, or the port of Qingdao, or port in Shanghai, you can't imagine the scale. Okay. I live in, when I'm back in the US, I come from the San Francisco Bay Area, and I see the port of Oakland, which is, I think, the third largest port in the United States. Okay. A big port. It's tiny compared to the port of Shenzhen. We don't have the scale. We can't understand this. And then feeding into the port of Shenzhen, or and also Shanghai, is this huge infrastructure of railways and highways that go right to the industrial zones. So this is the problem confronting developing countries, is that they are effectively stuck at the bottom of the value chain because they can't outcompete China. They basically are a raw materials provider to China, but they're never going to produce a phone more competitively than what the Chinese can do. They're not going to produce a car more competitively than what the Chinese can do. So normally when countries develop, they move up the value chain, they release the bottom end of that value chain for poorer countries to kind of pick up. So when Taiwan was making sneakers and tennis rackets, eventually it started moving up to semiconductors. It said it's not economical to produce sneakers and tennis rackets. So then Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Bangladesh pick up that light in manufacturing. And when they move up, they're going to release this to Myanmar and to other countries and so forth. China, though, and we saw this in the 15th five-year plan that came out this year, said, nope, we want to hold on to the entire value chain. We want to make the sneakers and the tennis rackets and the semiconductors. That is unprecedented at the scale that China does it. I don't say this as a good thing. I don't say it as a bad thing. I don't say it as a pro-China thing or an anti-China thing. It's just a statement of fact in the way it is. And at the same time, this has all contributed to these very complex emotions that a lot of people have. China is a vision of modernity and modernizing without westernizing. So they see that on social media, that you can build beautiful subways, beautiful cities, state-of-the-art technology, and you don't need Western ideas. You don't need Western freedoms. That was evident. That's what China's example has produced. But it's also produced this other dilemma for developing countries, that where do they fit in the global value chain if China can outproduce them?
Eric, it's interesting that when you talk about the beautiful subway and also you talk about the projects that build on the daily basis, that reminds me another city that I visited before. It's called Xinhuan. I'm sure that you have heard of it. And it's almost a brand new city. A lot of universities, a lot of small business owners they look for opportunities to expand. So again, there's no surprise and there's no denying that we're seeing this modernity of China. And also, again, echo your article's title, is influencing people and winning the friends. But let's talk about another piece of reality. This is what I find out by speaking to the people in Shanghai, in Beijing, and since I arrive and start to branch out. Internally speaking, that we look at the Chinese economy. Again, I don't mean to criticize China. I'm simply just stating the information that I collected over the periods. The younger generations in China today are rather anxious about the economy and also about the direction of the country. Because based on what you told me, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, that there are a plethora of opportunities overseas. People outside China, in Southeast Asia, many other countries, celebrating the Chinese product. A lot of small business owners or private enterprises, they're so joyous about what they can do overseas. But internally, there seemed to be a lot of pressure, a lot of economic stress within the society, among the younger generations. You're the expert, Eric.
It's not just it's not the younger generations only. It's
right.
The older generations.
So help me understand.
The property crisis has been devastating for people whose life savings have just
right.
gone
So my question is, by looking at what's happening outside China, is that going to be an incentive, or hopefully that can be a good opportunity to help with the internal economic pressure or change the dynamics, change the conversation a little bit more? What say you?
Not really, because the problems in China today are structural problems. That the way that the economy was set up, again, the property crisis is a good example of this. Also, and remember that a lot of China's problems today are self-inflicted. These are not as a result of global external changes bearing down on China, but because of decisions that Chinese leaders over decades have made. So the one-child policy was a domestic initiative. The property crisis, the way that they fund development in China is domestic. Those are domestic decisions. Those are nothing being done by the U.S. that's not been imposed by Japan or anybody else. And so the fact that now we've got a situation where there's not a single Chinese province that's not in debt is something of a domestic creation. This is, of course, again, I'm not to criticize, but this is where we are. We are in a situation in China that in many ways is like the situation in the United States and to some extent like in Europe, where there are structural problems in the economy that have led now to decreased opportunities for young people. So the same challenge that we face in other parts of the world, where we've moved from a kind of a pyramid economy where there's lots of opportunity at the base of the pyramid for young people to get entry-level jobs, we've now moved to a diamond economy where there's not very many opportunities at the entry level, but more in the mid-level. You need 2 to 5 to 6 years experience to get in the door. What a lot of Chinese young people are confronting is the same thing that young people everywhere are confronting, is that companies just don't need as many younger workers. There's been an oversupply of educated workers and an undersupply of blue-collar workers and vocational skills. And the Chinese are trying to readjust this and to put this more in balance. So I don't think that the opportunities are necessarily abroad for these Chinese young people, in part because what's happening when BYD moves abroad is that they're hiring locals in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in South Africa. So these are global companies, but they're not bringing over large quantities of Chinese people to set up the factories and to do innovation in other parts of the world. That's being done locally by staff in those regions. So in some respects, this is great for people in these regions. So when BYD sets up a factory in Indonesia, those are jobs for Indonesians. And in part, one of the things that the Chinese are able to do, and I use that Transsion example of customized products for local markets, one of the things that we're seeing in the trends is that as the Chinese move more of their manufacturing to closer to customers, those plants are designed to be much more adaptable to local needs. So if Indonesian consumers really like 3 seats and 1 window washer and pink cars, well, BYD will crank out that, and they can just adjust that one factory to do that. Then in South Africa, if people like purple cars and 5 seats and 4 windows and all the customizations that they want, I'm just making stuff up, of course. But that factory can then adapt to that.
Right.
But in order to have that local knowledge, you need local people. That's not something that's done from headquarters in Shenzhen or Shanghai. So that's why I'm not sure there's going to be a lot of external opportunities for Chinese people who are struggling, particularly young people who are struggling to get their foot in the job market necessarily by this trend of what we're seeing. There may be some, certainly, but for the most part, it's not going to be transformative.
Well, and also, Eric, based on what you just said, for the young people, it's not just about the opportunities. It's about the equipment. It's about the knowledge. I mean, today, a lot of younger generations, and again, I'm not criticizing all of them, but are mindless or clueless about what's happening around the world. I mean, again, it's not just about to say, hey, I speak the language or I speak English, and therefore that should get me to the middle level of the jobs, or at least can get my foot in the door. Sure, that may be a couple years ago, but today, when we talk about a country which is internationalized, it's not just about a language skill, it's about the information, it's about the knowledge. So in other words, how well do we know, or how well do they actually well prepared to get the jobs or to get the foot in the door? Because it looks like the society painting a picture, it's all about money and all about the figure, but no one will like to do the labor, or no one will like to do the jobs or tasks behind the doors. Am I right on this?
So I'm going to respectfully disagree in one respect. That is, I'm not a big fan of these kind of generational stereotypes. This young generation of Chinese, I mean, and I've been going back and forth to China since 1989. So my first time was there in 1989, and then I lived through much of the 90s, and then I worked there in the 2000s, and I've dedicated my entire professional career to living, and studying China. And the generation today is so much more cosmopolitan than you could have imagined 15, 20 years ago. I mean, just not even close, okay? The fact that so many young Chinese today speak English, have studied abroad, vacation, and, have seen the world, engage with people all over the world. When I was working in Shanghai, up until 2019, I ran a very large team at a global advertising agency. And the young people that I had working for me were incredible. So by definition, this understanding of international trends and international exposure is an elite pursuit. That's never been something that the common people in any country, by the way, that's the same in the US as it is in China or anywhere else. It takes a certain degree of resources to have that ability to travel, live, and work abroad and study abroad and develop that international awareness. So that's why I'm reluctant to kind of ascribe or to condemn this generation to being, stupid and ignorant and lazy or whatever. I think this generation is facing challenges that no generation's ever faced before. There's never been AI before. Okay. I mean, there's literally never been something that thinks for us, that competes for a space in the job market before. And that presents challenges. And China embraces technology so much faster than almost anywhere else that I know in the world. I mean, it is amazing how much they adapt their societies to technology. You're in Beijing right now, and if you did not have a cell phone and a phone number, I don't know how you get around a city like Beijing.
That's
Everything
right.
is tied to your phone, right?
Right.
And so as a result of that, that's a good thing and a bad thing. And the good thing is that it's very exciting to live. Again, it's rapidly modernizing. The bad thing is that it's often coming at the expense of humanity.
That's right.
And they don't need as many people in a lot of these jobs. But again, they have these distortions in the economy. If you try to get your toilet fixed or try to get your car fixed, it's very hard, just like in the US. If you're a plumber in the US, you can make a very, very good living today, or an electrician, because there's just not enough of them. And yet we've got
That's right.
a ton of college grads who are contributing to some of the highest youth unemployment in our history. So again, these distortions, some of what's happening in China is unique to China. Some of it is part of global trends. If you're in Europe, you're in Asia, you're in Latin America, and you're in China, it's the same situation.
Eric, I have two more questions before letting you go. Well, let's talk about policies. Again, going back to the article, this is what you wrote. The policymakers in the places, of course, we talk about the countries like Europe, Japan, South Korea, US, and many more. When it comes to national security concern over Chinese social media platforms, again, you mentioned like TikTok and WeChat, and of course, Red Notes, and many more. So, Eric, let's dive into a little bit more. Is that still the case today when we talk about social media platforms and versus national security concern? Believe me, because every day we're seeing this live streaming services on WeChat, on Red Note, and on TikTok. I mean, it's just day and night, like, unstoppable. Of course, again, the good thing is people are taking advantage of the opportunities. They're selling the Chinese brands in many languages. I've listened to the people on the platforms. They spoke German, they spoke Japanese, and Chinese, English, and all other languages. But meanwhile, when we talk about those platforms and when we talk about the drawbacks, one of the things is the national security concern. And this is something that I have not heard personally for a while, especially from the Western perspective. So based on your expertise and based on your research, where do we stand right now when we talk about the social media platforms, the flexibility versus the national security concerns? Your thoughts?
Well, the national security concerns are real. And this is not uniquely, again, a US or China issue. This is something that a lot of countries, both in the global south and the global north, are worried about. Data sovereignty, what happens to your people's data, who's using it, who's selling it. And this is becoming even more pertinent in the AI era, where there is so much opacity in terms of what happens to our information. When our queries go into ChatGPT or into DeepSeek, who gets to store that? Who's collecting that? Who's building profiles on us based on that? And as technology and this data becomes far more integrated between our car, our phone, our use on computers, individual profiles can be built really easily and very quickly. And so data sovereignty and national security about data is understandably a very, very big concern. Now, in Europe, for example, they have some of the toughest data privacy laws in the world. And so there's a lot of concern about Chinese data from vehicles in particular, and what happens to it. Is it going to be stored in European servers so that it can be accessed and they know what happens to it? The Chinese have not been as forthcoming on this as they probably should be if they really want to expand. This is what drove the concerns on Capitol Hill about TikTok and the shift to nationalize TikTok in the US. Now, the irony is that what Trump did in the end probably did not do much in terms of data protection, but did a lot to make his friends very, very wealthy. But the effort, the underlying effort and concern was, what's happening to this TikTok data? We need it to be stored on US servers so we can see what's happening. I don't think that we really know. And that's been a big problem with these corporations, Facebook, Douyin, ByteDance, any number of these companies are not as forthcoming with their use of data as I think a lot of us would like them to be. So I think when we talk about national security and data, this is a pertinent, real concern, again, all over the world. In Vietnam and elsewhere, they want to start building more data sovereignty legislation so that you have to host the people's data in that country that it's operating in, and not ship it back to China where it can be used, or the US where it can be used beyond for ways that people don't know.
Eric, I want to end our conversation by going back to the title of your article, How China is Winning Friends and Influencing People. The last aspect that I want to talk about, it's not only through these private companies, we talk about economy, we talk about business, but another critical and also impeccable way to influence friends or people around the globe is culture and languages. I remember that several years ago, I connected with some Chinese youth that they just successfully completed their training from what they called the Chinese Confucius Institute. And I believe there are still so many universities and schools are still having this part of institute continue to influence the Chinese, use the Chinese culture or language to make friendships, etc. So do you think today, so in addition to look at the private businesses or companies, and what happened to the language and culture aspect? Are people still buying into these ideas, or are people still looking for ways to learn the language and to study the culture? Again, as you mentioned before, a lot of people who are still unfamiliar with China. Again, I don't mean just to look at the content on YouTube or on social media, but really dive into a little bit deeper. One more thing I want to share with you is a couple years ago, prior to pandemic, I happened to be in Cairo, Egypt, and I was on a tour. One thing I was amazed that as a tourist in Egypt, in Cairo, that a lot of Egyptians, we'll talk about younger generation Egypt, they spoke fluent Chinese and giving tours to the international friends, especially the Chinese guests who didn't speak Chinese. And I was amazed by that. And then, of course, I struck a conversation as a journalist. I said, how could you guys end up speaking fluent Chinese? If I remember correctly, that was 2018, prior to the pandemic. And they told me distinctively that Chinese language was the fourth popular language in Egypt back in the days. So that really brought me to I
have a feeling that's a little bit of fourth, because Arabic, English, French, and then the distant.
Right, there you go. Right. So coming back to my question,
I wouldn't read too much into that.
Right. So Eric, coming back to your article or to our discussion is, so what happened to the language and culture aspect? Are they still the mechanism to influence friends and winning people? Your final thoughts.
Well, again, so I think we have to talk about different parts of the world. First of all, it shouldn't really be that big of a surprise to you that tour guides in the tourism industry has built a Chinese language capacity, because there's just so many Chinese tourists that are coming. That's very, very limited in terms of the spread. When you go to Egypt, and I spend a lot of time there and other places, Chinese is not a commonly spoken language, and it will never be a commonly spoken language. It's just too difficult a language to learn. But here in Southeast Asia, that's a different story. where the Chinese diaspora is significant. So Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, all over, Chinese language is quite prevalent. But that's not going to be the case in Latin America or so language wise, we're not going to see it. And these Confucius institutes, you they're no different than the Alliance Française or the Goethe Institute, the Germans. I mean, they train an incredibly small number of people. So let's not overstate the effectiveness of the Confucius Institutes in terms of moving the needle. Let's kind of, I mean, so it's just, it's 20 kids per class or 20 people per class. They have maybe, 50 classes in one Confucius Institute. Again, and then usually that's training elites for the most part. Okay, so the Confucius Institutes to me are overblown in terms of their effectiveness in terms of mass education. Where we see this change, though, is on the culture side. Let's not forget that when you are, watching in the U.S., Netflix has changed the game for us to watch dramas from all over the world. We now watch, Squid Game in the U.S., which is Korean.
That's right.
I mean, so, in Korean dramas in particular are a great example of how portable those have been. And people around the world have been watching dubbed Korean dramas now for more than a decade. Here in Southeast Asia in particular, Chinese micro dramas, these are these 60 to 90-second micro dramas that you get on social media, are extraordinarily adaptable. The storylines are very simple. Lots of drama, lots of tension, lots of love, lots of failed love, lots of, backstabbing. And it just makes you keep kind of scrolling to get to the next story.
That's it.
People don't seem to care that they're Chinese actors there. But what they do see oftentimes is that these are set in modern Chinese cities where they see the background. And again, that modernity vision is something like, ooh, and if you're sitting in a modernizing part of the world, like in Vietnam, and you see the Chengdu subway in China, again, you think to yourself, that's pretty cool. I want that.
Yep.
That's the direction I want to go in. So there is something aspirational. The same way that when people around the world used to watch soap operas, I'm going to date you right now, but like Dynasty and Dallas, and these were during the Cold War, and they showed this America that was big and flashy and wealthy and rich, and people thought that was America. That's what we want to be. We're seeing that now happen with Chinese content. And so there's this misperception in the United States in particular and in Europe that soft power is Beyonce, soft power is the Beatles, soft power is Western. And what I want to be very clear is that Chinese content is now making its way to many parts of the world. And particularly here in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, on my Vietnamese Netflix, okay, that is on when I'm on the local version of Netflix, and this is all algorithmically driven. There's no humans kind of setting this up. The first strip of content is, what's new on Netflix, right?
That's right.
The next strip of content here in Vietnam is hot new Chinese dramas.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so C-pop, if you will, and C-dramas and C-movies are becoming increasingly popular alongside with Korean, Japanese, and others. And so there's this myth that Western power has diminished around the world, at least our soft power is still strong. And I want to disabuse everybody of that, because more and more today, young people consume their own content, TikTok, social media, Instagram.
That's right.
So they're not even watching Western content. And then more and more what's feeding into that are Chinese content, Chinese kind of cars, Chinese tech and whatnot. So that's how, in some senses, we're creating this atmosphere where people, and particularly younger generations, this is not a political thing. They're not aspiring for the Chinese political system to come to their country. I don't know of anybody that wants an authoritarian Marxist system that's run by that's modeled in the CCP to come to their country. That's not their ambition. But they want so many things of what China has produced to come to their country. The modernity, the wealth, the infrastructure, the knowledge, all of these things that have been produced. And there's a very subtle relationship, but it's a very complex relationship. We Americans oftentimes are so reductive, binary people. Do you like us or do you like them? Are you with us or are you with them? And it's not that. There's an enormous amount of gray in between all of this. And so when the Chinese are producing cars, phones, content, apps, technologies, power, all of these things that are making people's lives better in meaningful, practical, tangible ways, that naturally is going to extend then some goodwill to China and Chinese stakeholders for bringing that to them and making them part of this development story. That's the most important takeaway from the article.
Thank you. I mean, again, it's a great reminder, not only for our listeners, but also for people who are still unfamiliar with China, but still thinking about or trying to create their own ideas about China. I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out this amazing article. How China is winning friends and influencing people. Private companies are making Beijing look good in the developing world, and written by Mr. Eric Olander, who's an editor-in-chief of the China Global South Project. Well, Eric, it's been a great conversation. Again, I have to say that by having the conversation with a scholar like you, not only it's informative, but also it's engaging for us to really understand something that we don't know or we haven't really heard, but most importantly is to bring the positivity into our podcast. So thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and let's keep in touch, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention to what's happening to China and also around the world. So thank you so much for your time.